So I kind of feel the place to sort of start with the future is actually, it's looking back a wee bit, but whenever I hear Tim speaking, or when he writes about Heligan and the restoration, this kind of phrase constantly crops up, which is, we did not restore the lost gardens of Heligan in order to preserve the past in Aspic. So that relationship between the past, the present, and the future is what prevent. I mean, you know, as delicious as a garden in Aspic may sound, it is really that relationship between the past and the present and the future that I think kind of brings the meaning and relevance to Heligan. And I guess what I feel is that alongside beauty, it's relevance and meaning that are going to sustain our success, that the garden has to mean something, what we do has to mean something. So kind of thinking about the future, I'm probably just going to bang on about one thing in particular that Nicola said, which is heritage varieties of fruit and vegetable, which are kind of really at the heart of what we do. And I just want to talk a bit about their relevance and meaning being beyond their connection with the past or their antiquity as a variety or whatever it is. And in this conversation, I'd just sort of like to pop into your mind what I feel, and billions of other people feel, is one of the most important questions facing us as a species at the moment. And God knows we've got a few questions like that. How do we feed ourselves without destroying the planet? So just put that out there. So this is the apple arch, one of our big iconic parts of the garden. Everyone loves to be photographed there. It was planted, or is planted, with heritage varieties of apple, both dessert and cooking apples. And it runs on a sort of gentle slope down to the melon yard, and so our kind of later flowering varieties are planted down at the lower end to try and avoid the late frosts. Sorry, excuse me. But at the top is one of our very oldest varieties, not just of apple, of anything. It's an apple called a Devonshire Quarrenden, and that was first, I think, noted as a specific variety in 1679. So it's got a bit of age on it. And I mention it in connection with a scientific paper that we were sent 2 or 3 years ago by a lovely chap called Professor Leon Terry from Cranfield University. And the title, it's very snappy title, which is, I'm going to have to read it here. It's Biochemical Profile of Heritage and Modern Apple Cultivars and Application of Machine Learning Methods to Predict Usage, Age and Harvest Season, which is not the sort of article I usually kind of read, but it was absolutely fascinating. And at its absolute kind of basic kind of premise was comparing heritage and modern varieties of cooking, dessert and cider apples. And its starting point, I'm going to read this, its starting point, and I quote this from the sort of preface of the thing, is that although more than 7,500 varieties of apples exist worldwide, many heritage varieties have been abandoned, despite a resurgence observed in recent years. And they've been abandoned in favor of mainstream varieties emerging from intensive selective breeding programs during the past few decades, leading to the decline of traditional apple orchards in many countries, including the United Kingdom. And this is the important bit, is the reason for this is the drive for sweet, crisp apples, which are uniform in size and appearance and have acceptable disease resistance and prolonged shelf life. As a result, many ancient cultivars have been irreversibly lost. Well, you could say, well, that's a shame, but it doesn't really matter because we've still got lovely, pretty, crisp, sweet, juicy apples that last a long time. So kind of what's the problem? And the problem here is that, well, I go back to my dear old, I can hear as all my grandmothers in particular, every day there seemed to be some sort of quote, but the great English aphorism of an apple a day keeps the doctor away. And one of the things that Professor Terry's paper did was introduce me to the world of dihydrochalcones. And again, not a word I use very often, but they're one of the sort of complex range of phenolic compounds that to be found in apples. And great, but what do? But as you can see here, they do a hell of a lot. They have anti-diabetic, anti-tumor. I mean, you can read it, but these are the things that repel doctors. And the really concerning thing about Leon Terry's paper and his colleagues' papers was that the selective breeding programs for those modern, crisp, pretty apples, actually a byproduct is breeding out all of these phenolic compounds. So the apple is no longer going to keep the doctor away. It's going to look nice on a shelf. It'll hit all the buttons that we require from our apples these days, but it's not going to keep the doctor away. There are, of course, some traditional heritage varieties, certainly in this country, that's still quite popular. Cox's Orange Pippin, Bramley's and Russets are all kind of laden with this sort of thing. But to me, that is a really, sorry, I've just totally lost my place. A really fundamental point about why heritage varieties are not just a nice to have. They don't just sort of fit in quite nicely with what we do. That heritage varieties are not just a thematic element of a historic garden, but are a future, their long-term health. And what could be more relevant to a garden than holding those keys to nourishment and to health? It's sort of Eden itself. The other important thing that we're involved in, and we touched on it earlier, which relates to their questions about heritage seed libraries, etc., is that clearly what we have is an incredibly important genetic resource, and preserving and conserving those things are incredibly important. And I don't mean just in terms of, they sort of predate chemical fertilizers, but also in combating pests and diseases, particularly in the shadow of a changing climate. We're going to need all available resources. And as Nicola recounted 30 years ago, many common heritage varieties today were almost impossible to find. And I'm really delighted to say that Katie Kingett, who's our supervisor, works very closely with the Heritage Seed Library, and she's actually a seed guardian. So she's very much kind of on the front end of conserving and distributing these precious seeds. And if we're talking about the future, I think Heligan's role is very much in continuing to pursue that and develop that as part of our brief. I think the other side of things is also nutrition. I mean, we talked about health, we've talked about the genetic resource at our disposal with heritage varieties, but it has been well documented. I mean, it's just a fact that our fruit and our vegetables are less nutritious now than they were in 1900. And there's been, you know, a raft of scientific papers done on the nutrition. I think the concerning thing right now is there's no clear evidence exactly why, but I think there's reasonable, it would be reasonable to say that our methods of cultivation are probably responsible. And in particular, that is the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, and the effects they're having on soil health. And modern varieties of fruit, vegetable bred for yield are failing to produce themselves or uptake nutrient in the same way as occurred with heritage crops in 1880. So when we think about heritage varieties at Heligan, and heritage or heirloom varieties have a kind of quite elastic sort of sense. They're a bit like antiques, really, I suppose, that as long as they're over 100 years old, they qualify. But at Heligan, we really look for our varieties to be pre-1910. Now, this was based on it being a few years before the outbreak of the First World War, marks the end of the Edwardian period. So we are very much late Victorian Edwardian garden. But it has a really profound resonance beyond that, I think, the state of 1910, which sort of comes to these gentlemen, Fritz Haber and Karl Bosch. So the summer of 1909 sees Fritz Haber nail the chemical process to produce kind of ammonia. And in 1910, Karl Bosch nailed the development of this process at an industrial scale. So the Haber-Bosch process, as I'm sure people are familiar with, delivers ammonia, breakthrough moment in terms of chemical fertilizer production. And it absolutely has transformed the way we eat, the way we farm, and the way we nourish ourselves and our approach to land. It also produced an industrial and economic way to deliver explosives. So as a moment in the 20th century, I think it's hard to look beyond the Haber-Bosch in 1910 as predicting the future of the rest of that century. And it continues to do so. I mean, God, where are we now? It's like we've come full circle. We're being held to ransom via fossil fuels and fertilizer production, et cetera, by a dictator in 2022. And even today, the Haber-Bosch process, we depend on something like 60% of our food. We depend on this for, and it burns, 1% of the annual world's energy supply. It's we are in a crazy situation. But pre-1910 crops, by their very definition, predate Haber-Bosch and our dependence on fossil fuel fertilizer. in a future where I think we all understand in terms of soil inputs, fertilizers, manures, whatever you want to call them, is that we need to be carbon based, not chemical. We need to be looking at those varieties that were in existence, were nourishing people, growing pre-1910, pre this system. Now, I'll say this again, it's not that I think, you know, all the answers are to be found in heritage variety crops or in historic fruit and vegetable gardens, but we've got something. You know, we talk about cultivation in terms of organic matter. We talk about feeding soil, not plants. And the productive gardens at Heligan are, you know, very much about heritage varieties, but as Nicola was saying so beautifully earlier, it's about people and skills. And God, knowledge is fragile. I mean, we've been through at Heligan, you know, the past 10 years, a real up and down where for various reasons, that knowledge began to slip away. Nicola wasn't on site for a couple of years, and that made a huge difference. It is fragile, and I think if I'm thinking about what does success look like, success has to look like legacy, and that legacy isn't just plants, that's people. When I think about our future, most, you know, what wakes me up at night is that legacy, is that concern about people and skills. So our next goal is to create a practical residential apprenticeship, studentship, however we want to call it, which is absolutely based on understanding the fundamental horticultural skills. It's not that we want everyone to go off and recreate a 19th century garden, but the skills required to deliver what Nicola and her team have delivered year after year after year. Those are just such fundamentally important techniques for our survival. And as a horticulturalist, whatever you do, if you did 2 years with Nicola and her team in the productive garden at Heligan, you would walk away with some consummate skills. So when I think, you know, to sort of end up that conversation, I would say about the future and historic gardens that historic fruit and vegetable gardens absolutely should be about not forgetting our past, but we must not forget our future either. We must not forget to keep asking ourselves, why is this important? What's it all mean? Why are we doing it? Historic fruit and vegetables, and I'm repeating myself now, but they don't have all the answers to the question of how we feed ourselves without destroying the planet. But we can find important clues in these repositories of nutrition, productivity, and skills, and a bit of light to help us find the pathway in the ensuing darkness. And I think that's, you know, you want to talk about success in the future. That is what success in the future looks like. So by their nature, you know, historic fruit and vegetable gardens and the theatre Nicola was talking about, and all that, they're, you know, really dipped in nostalgia. But I love that. But I think in the 21st century, they represent a lot more. And when I think about historic fruit and vegetable gardens in the future, I don't think of nostalgia. I think of inspiration, I think of hope, and I think of regeneration. And those are the things. That's the legacy, that's success. So yeah.
Thank you for such a passionate speech. Thank you so much. Thank you. I think you don't see everybody, so you can't see, but I see many people applauding. It was great.
Is that because I've finished?
Not only. Okay, some comments or questions. I think that's such a wonderful conclusion for our whole cycle of conferences, because you raise some critical points which are just marvelous for concluding our online conferences and for opening our discussions in Chambord. So that's great. That's great.
Thank you.
Lucy, you had something?
Many comments, Alasdair and Nicola. I don't. If you can have a look through the chat, we'll send it to you anyway.
Okay.
But comments more than questions now.
Yeah. So somebody wants to make comments or questions, or I see Sarah reading the. Sarah, you have comments, questions?
My comment, Alasdair, was that particularly the last session was very thought-provoking. You know, it is really something to dwell on and something to inspire young people in horticulture too. You know, why am I embarking on this as a career? You know, what does it mean? And where am I going to go with it? You know, so when you hear words that you've spoken, it's very inspiring, you know, and I hope, you know, young horticulturalists take it on board and buy into it, you know, plus the enthusiasm which comes through too, which is just great. Being able to inspire is part of it, isn't it? The role that you play in management in horticulture is to really engage with young gardeners in particular and make them see a pathway into the future that is inspirational and full of hope, hopefully.
Yeah. Well, I think, and it's something that maybe Nicola and I didn't sort of dwell on enough, but is the thing that's really key to and I think it's kind of, we just sort of assume it, is the key to Heligan is narrative, is storytelling, is, you know, we're here to engage with people as well as celebrate all the things we've talked about. And again, it's something that we dipped a bit over we had a funny, well, not funny at all, because of the central role of and this is quite meaningful, I think, because of the central role that the First World War plays within the gardens narrative. During 2014, 2018, the commemoration, this is before sort of my time, but the decision was made to remove all the interpretation, all the boards and the explanations of what's going on and what things are, in order for the garden to really be sort of as it was when just before the men went off to fight, etc., etc. Which was a beautiful kind of poetic, sort of lyrical thing to think of. But what it did was make it very difficult for people to understand what we were doing. But, you know, people had the sort of narrative, but where it really impacted, this lack of storytelling, lack of interpretation, was in the team, and where you had new people joining the team and not really quite, there wasn't the effort being made to engage with them and tell that story. And slowly but surely, and dear Nicola went off and did some other things for a time, and very quickly that kind of the fabric of what we're doing and why we're doing it began to fray and began to kind of unravel. And it is really, it's fragile. We go back to the skills and knowledge, but the storytelling, and that's something we've really committed to in this, our 30th year being open to the public. We've suddenly realized, oh my God, we're not delivering one of the really, we know we're doing great things and it's great and we love ourselves, but, you know, we're not communicating. And that's something that's really we're really pushing at the moment. And it is, you know, as a public garden, we're a story. I don't know.
No, absolutely, I totally agree. And wherever, I was saying earlier about, you know, if ever we put the cropping schedule out and people, you know, want to photograph that and look at it, and, you know, the before and after pictures as well, which, you know, people love that. We've always, from the very beginning, I think that was Tim's amazing skill at, you know, taking everybody along with you for the story. And I think, you know, we realised that that's still very critical, you know, to take us into the next 30 years. I'm sure you all have that same experience, that you know, people would absolutely love to know what you're doing and be in there. It doesn't have to be pretty all the time. They like the nitty gritty as well, don't they? They like to see it from the beginning, what's going on. So I think, you know, that's hugely important, very much so. Yeah, definitely.
We have a question for you. Do you participate in scientific research concerning the nutritional qualities of old varieties?
So, so far, no. I've been having conversations with various universities and academic institutes for, I've been at Heligan for 3 years, and for 2 years I've been having these conversations, trying to engage with academic research, in particular because for our storytelling, we can say, oh, we're doing this and it's great, isn't it? But we, you know, we need to back it up with facts. And again, I've been backwards and forwards a little bit with Leon Terry, and I think it's vital that we have the facts. The issues I'm just having is, you know, there a lot of universities, certainly in the UK, are constantly chasing relatively small amounts of money for short-term projects. And, you know, what I really want to do is get involved in, or be a little part of something that looks at soil, plant health and nutrition. But finding the funding for that is quite tricky. And if you're looking at short term, you know, any academic study, it's 4 or 5 years max. Well, you can't do anything sensible on soil that's less than 10 years, because it's a complex ecosystem. It's not an engineering medium for holding up plants, and trying to chase that. And there's a good friend of mine who's lovely guy, if you ever get to meet him, a chap called Andy Neal, who works at the Rothamsted Institute, and I'm putting my hopes on him at the moment to come up with a big project. But yeah, we're working with Plymouth University, and we've got 3 projects that we're actually, Nicola's starting with. Why don't you tell the folks about them?
So we just very sort of simple project this year, because we just want to get the ball rolling. As Alasdair says, we can keep going on, and we're like, let's do something at least. So we are going to do just a small kind of test with working the soil in 4 different ways, and repeating that 4 times. And within that, we're just going to be growing chard. That we just needed something that was easy to manage and look after. But they were quite interested to look at nutritionally. Chard's quite an interesting crop because it's a very long crop throughout the season. And, you know, we were interested to try very early in the season, what's its nutritional value, later, you know, in the midst of the season and at the end of the season. So we've got you know, sort of 16 beds that we'll test from, and we'll be taking samples from them, freezing them. They'll tell us exactly how to do it, the protocol for gathering the plant material, and then afterwards they're going to be testing for just nutritional value. So it's not necessarily specifically heritage and the long term, it's just a very short term thing, and quite an interesting, simple experiment just to see about the basic, when is that plant most nutritious throughout its life cycle. So first project.
And I think it reflects also that we're trying to come to terms with well, not come to terms, trying to understand more about our soil and how it works, because elegant soil is what I believe people call an anthropomorphic soil. In fact, you know, just me, it's totally kind of created because we cultivate it so much. It's had human influence for so long, and so and soil is the great, you know, brave new world, and just we're a highly dig based garden, and obviously there's a huge amount of evidence of the benefits of no dig, but equally we're here representing late 19th century, early 20th century garden. So there's a little bits of conflicts there, but it is about understanding. And the more we can work with universities and people that know more than us, the better.